So welcome, everybody. Transylvania Partners for Democracy would like to welcome you here. We are so glad to see this good group. I think a lot of you probably know now who we are. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan group of county residents. We started a couple of years ago. We are committed to the basic principles of our democracy, such as the guarantees in the Bill of Rights, respect for the rule of law, an independent judiciary, and free and fair elections. Our commitment in this last 2 years, as we've begun to hold forums, has been to keep our own county alert and aware of all the ways the policies, both state and national, impact us. So this year, we've done a forum on the National Park Service and veterans, on health care, on education, and tonight on free speech. So I want to welcome all the members of we have a lot of members now of Transylvania Partners, and I want to welcome guests who are not members yet. And would the board members please raise their hands? We'd like to thank Catherine, who does all of our tech support. And while I'm thanking Catherine, I want you to know, too, that you can go onto our website and find previous forums that have been recorded, and tonight's forum will be on. I think it'll take maybe a week or so for it to be posted on there. And so if you have friends that have missed this and that you want to share it with, make sure you let them know. The restrooms, most of you know, are right outside the door to the right. Our plates are reusable, so please make sure that they don't get discarded, that they go in that little Aldi basket. There are cards for questions. If you didn't get them, Brian is by the door and can hand them to you. We have a runner who will be picking them up and getting them to the facilitator, who is John Lanier, who is our own John Lanier. From the Transylvania Times in the past. And we'd like for you to consider becoming a member of our group. We'd like to have more and more active membership so that you can help us decide what we want to do in the future, how to be more effective, how to help people have tools to respond to some of the things that we're facing. And let's see, donations, I would say, are absolutely crucial to our work. We've been so fortunate to have guest speakers who have been gracious enough to come for, not a lot of big, hefty fees, but we have had incredible speakers. So we need to have the resources to be able to keep this going in a meaningful way. If somebody on the board would please say what I've left out. I imagine there's something.
You're good.
Okay.
You're good.
All right.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks for all of you being here tonight. I hope you can hear me and to hear our esteemed guests. When you came in on your seat, there's a sheet with Supreme Court cases from the last century. And I don't think we're going to be referring to those, but it's just to give you an idea of free speech and how it's progressed through the courts in the 1900s. So we might have some questions about that. But I think it's important that you know what has happened in the past, particularly when you hear about the president saying, well, you can't burn the flag. That case is in here. So there's a lot of things in there that I think are pretty pertinent as far as the First Amendment goes in free speech. So tonight I feel really fortunate. We have two excellent panelists here sitting beside me. To my right is Tom Fiedler. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning political reporter. I don't think you've ever had one in this auspicious place before. He spent 35 years at the Miami Herald before he became the dean of the Boston University College of Communications in 2008. He's the winner of numerous awards in news reporting as well as editorial writing. Tom is also a key figure in the creation of Asheville Watchdog, and when he created that, gosh, wrong information here. And he's been a regular contributor to the online news magazine there. And he's done some excellent reporting recently if you go to the Asheville Watchdog. To my left is Ivy Johnson. And Ivy graduated from the University of North Carolina Law School and became staff attorney for the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. She then served as capital defense attorney at the Center for the Death Penalty Litigation, where she successfully won her client a new trial after 29 years on North Carolina's death row. Thank you for doing that. Ivy's now a staff attorney at the ACLU of North Carolina. She manages a range of cases aimed at protecting the constitutional rights of individuals and groups, regardless of their political outlook. In the case of Dames versus Roberts, Johnson is the lead attorney challenging UNC Chapel Hill's aggressive police clearance of a peaceful encampment against the war in Gaza as a violation of the First, Fourth, and 14th Amendments. Excuse me. And then finally myself, I've taught 20 years here in the county and 3 in South Carolina. And then worked for 21 years at the Transylvania Times, the last 14 years as the editor. So, what we'll do, thank you. So what we'll do first is, who wants to go first? Okay, so Ivy will go first, and basically what we'll do is she'll make a small presentation, then Tom will make a small presentation, then I'll make a really small presentation, and then we'll have some questions from the audience, and hopefully we kind of have maybe more little informal conversation up here. During the presentations, there will be 2 runners, Brian to the right, and Mark Burrows to the back there. And so if you have any questions, there should be a piece of paper on your little note card. You can write those down, hand them to one of those 2 gentlemen, and they will bring it up to me, and then we'll try to work all the questions in as we can, okay? So again, thank you all very much for being here. Appreciate it very, very much. So Ivy, it's all yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. I said these are the same mics they use in court, so I'm pretty familiar with them. Closer? Oh, I'm not that familiar then. Yeah, so I was asked to speak about the First Amendment as it relates to academic freedom, and I ultimately decided I was going to put together a PowerPoint presentation, but decided I wanted to not lecture everyone and just sort of more informally talk about the development of academic freedom as a concept that is protected by the First Amendment, and then maybe talk about some of the real life situations I've had to handle in some of the cases we've seen at the ACLU. And so this handy sheet of critical Supreme Court cases is going to be referred to because one of the key cases dealing with First Amendment rights in schools is on the back, Tinker versus Des Moines, and it's one of the cases that we refer to sort of most frequently in litigation. And it is dealing specifically with student speech. I'll get to sort of teacher and professor speech in a moment. But it sort of created what is now the standard for when schools can restrict student speech. And it also contains sort of the landmark quote of students don't lose their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gates. So while students' speech can be restricted more in the public school setting, that doesn't mean that it can be restricted entirely. And so I don't know if it's worth going through a whole background, but the case, like you can see the year 1969, it all started in 1965 when Mary Beth Tinker and some classmates decided that they were going to wear black armbands in protest of the Vietnam War. They were told that that was a violation of the dress code and that they could not wear those armbands or they would face suspension. So nonetheless, they showed up to school wearing their armbands and were indeed suspended and filed a lawsuit. It's called a Section 1983 lawsuit. That's our federal law that allows private individuals to challenge what they perceived to be unconstitutional actions by government actors. So they filed a Section 1983 law school alleging that their public school had violated, or lawsuit alleging their public school had violated their First Amendment rights. And the court ruled pretty overwhelmingly, 7-2, that the First Amendment applies to public schools, and that the wearing of the armband, though it was an action, constitutes speech and is therefore protected. And they created this standard where that we sort of just we talk about the Tinker standard, and Tinker Plus is what we say a lot. But in order for the speech to be lawfully restricted, it has to sort of materially interfere with and disrupt school operations. So this action of just wearing a black armband is peaceful, non-disruptive. It's just students expressing their political views and was deemed to be protected. So the Fourth Circuit, which is the court circuit that we are in here, that's our federal appeals court circuit, which is Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, has sort of taken this case and essentially divided this ruling into three categories where public schools have more authority to regulate speech. So the first is when the speech is vulgar and or offensive, when the speech bears the imprimatur of the school, so that can include like a school newspaper, for example, because that is sponsored by the school and has the school's name, and when the speech can be interpreted as promoting illegal drugs. There's actually a pretty famous case out of Alaska of a student who put up, I believe the sign said giant joint at a school event, and that was considered to just be a phrase and not active promotion of illegal drug use, and that was considered protected speech, which is a fun case to read. And so this case, this is from 1969, but is actively used today. I've briefed this case many times. It comes up a lot, and most recently this past year, I handled a case out of Cleveland County where a high school junior had started her freshman year what was called the Activism Club at her school at Shelby High School, where the whole purpose of the club was to meet during school hours, and they would discuss just important social issues that the students themselves deemed were important. The school had this free period where clubs that were not related to the curriculum could meet and discuss, and they had a Dungeons and Dragons club, they had a Bible club, and they had activism club and a number of other clubs. And they wanted to do sort of a Pride Month event, and my client sort of put together a Jeopardy-style game of questions where the answers were historically, culturally significant LGBTQ plus individuals. So it was like Lady Gaga, or who is the first out gay mayor of San Francisco, Harvey Milk, that sort of thing. And the school forbid her and the club from playing the game. And what we believed was a pretty clear violation of her and her classmates' First Amendment rights. And we were able to rely on this Tinker standard. Nothing was vulgar or offensive. They did try to suggest that Lady Gaga's open bisexuality was somehow vulgar, but it's just sort of a fact. And we filed a lawsuit. I like to think that our lawsuit was so well written and well briefed that they immediately caved. I don't know if that's the case so much as they didn't want to go through the trouble of litigating it, but we did. We were able to settle it almost immediately. The court approved our settlement. The court has to approve settlements when it involves a minor. And our client and the group were able to play the game, I think, within 2 weeks of our court date. So, yeah, it was a very good result for us. We even got some attorney's fees out of it, which is not always the case. But that just, I think, goes to show how long-standing some of these First Amendment principles are, that this case from 1969 is still being actively applied today in 2025. And so that's sort of the origin of primary and secondary schools, students' rights, and I think it's important. There's not really a seminal case outlining the First Amendment rights of college and graduate students. They are generally afforded much broader protections because they're considered adults, they're older, and the university setting is much more forgiving and less restrictive than in high schools and middle schools and elementary schools where the state has an interest in educating its students, and parents also have an interest in directing the education of their children. The the first time the Supreme Court ever really identified or acknowledged the concept of academic freedom is actually in a case from 1957, Sweezy versus New Hampshire, which is not on this sheet. I'm happy to provide you with a legal citation. But, so that's really considered the first proactive inference of the concept of academic freedom as being protected by the First Amendment. And that came out of where New Hampshire had a law that basically said, it was during a lot of the Red Scare and like McCarthyism, and when anyone who was ever affiliated with any sort of socialist or communist was often being prosecuted, and New Hampshire had one of these laws, and a state attorney general there caught wind of a college professor who was giving a lecture on Marxism as part of his history class. And that professor was subpoenaed to come testify about his connections to known socialists and communists based on the fact that he was delivering a lecture about Marxism. And he refused to, was held in contempt and convicted of contempt, and sort of appealed it up through the courts all the way to the Supreme Court. And the court ultimately held that a professor can't really be prosecuted for what they're saying in their lectures. Again, there's a standard, like you can't imminently advocate for violence and sort of similar vulgar and offensive language. But the key quote from that case, I think, is that a free society depends on free universities. I think there are a number of cases that identify free speech and academic freedom in particular as being one of our pillars of democracy, and universities as being the real marketplace of ideas, and where students are sent to be taught on what might be divisive and controversial concepts, but what they're there for is to really learn how to learn, and you have to be confronted with difficult concepts in order to create your own worldviews, and that's sort of the point of the First Amendment, is to allow people to engage in conversation and meaningful discourse, and something that might be offensive to me may not be offensive to someone else, and that doesn't mean it's not protected speech, basically. So here we go. And focus us back to North Carolina. In 2011, this was kind of, I wasn't here back then, but this was a case that people, I did not go to college in North Carolina, but at UNC Wilmington, there was a professor there who was sort of a known conservative Christian, regularly writing about his moral and religious values and posting on websites. And he was up for tenure, and as a part of his tenure packet included some of these publications of his that were unrelated to his teachings, unrelated to his position at UNCW, and he was denied tenure. And he alleged that that was viewpoint discrimination and retaliation against his writings in violation of the First Amendment. And there was this sort of interesting conversation about when is speech by professors protected, when is it considered part of their professional duties, because obviously universities also have sort of an interest in directing their curricula and what they do and don't want to teach. Not everything is protected. And the court ultimately held that these publications, which were made completely separate from his official role with the university, were protected speech then, because it was not part of, again, like his curricula, and the university couldn't really direct his private speech. And just because they were used in his tenure packet, it doesn't make it then unprotected speech. So while we may not agree with everything this professor has said, it's a pretty pivotal case in North Carolina and in the Fourth Circuit that protects professors' rights to sort of speak privately despite being public university employees. And so I think another like pretty important concept when it comes to the First Amendment that I think is highlighted in that case is that the difference between public versus private. So that professor was at UNCW. That's a public university. That's considered the state any restriction on his speech is considered state action and therefore subject to the First Amendment. If you were at Duke, for example, that's a private university, and they can kind of do whatever they want with regards to that. Like, there are separate laws to deal with his, teachers' unions, labor unions, that sort of thing that may come into play there. But the First Amendment only protects individuals when it comes to government infringement on speech. So there's when you're considering First Amendment violations, you first have to ask who is doing the bad action. Is it a private person, a private company, or is it the government? And then there are other things to consider. I guess I'll get into it. There's something called forum analysis. So where are you when you are giving the speech? Is it a traditional public forum like streets and parks? Is it a designated or limited public forum like portions of our public university campuses? Is it a private forum? In a traditional public forum, the government cannot infringe on your speech rights. In a traditional or in a limited or designated public forum, if there's this weird nuance where, like, let's say, well, I'll speak to it because I am the lead attorney on Dames versus Roberts, which is our case challenging UNC's forceful, violent clearing of a peaceful encampment on its campus on Polk Place. If there are any alum, Polk Place is larger than a football field. It's a portion of UNC's campus that functions very similarly to a park. It's a big grassy quad that students, non-students, anyone in the community can sort of freely walk through at any time. There are no policies that require a reservation for its use. Like, anyone can sort of go there, which means that UNC has opened it up as if it were a traditional public forum, and therefore, if you are a person for whom that portion of campus was opened, which in this case is sort of anyone, then you get to enjoy the fullest protections of the First Amendment while you are there. Or at least that is our argument in our case. There's a pretty important case out of Maryland, at the University of Maryland, brought by the ACLU of Maryland, called ACLU versus Moat, where there was an individual on University of Maryland's campus, an amphitheater, leafleting, whatever it was, who was then sort of expelled from campus. And that's where the court sort of came up with these forum distinctions with respect to public universities. And at that forum in Maryland, non-students did actually have to have a reservation for use of the space and had to be affiliated with a student. So there was a very specific group of people for whom that forum was opened, unlike Polk Place and other portions of UNC's campus and other UNC schools' campuses that are just sort of open to whoever. And so I think with respect to, what probably a lot of people are interested in is the use of social media. And that's where this sort of imprimatur of the school becomes very important. And for any public employee, because again, it's important to remember, if you work for a private entity, they can kind of do whatever, especially in North Carolina, an at-work state or an at-will state. We don't have many labor protections. You don't have to have cause to be terminated. But if you work at a public institution, for public university, for public library, you do have protections, and things that you say on your personal social media accounts, so long as they are not sort of, I'm a public library employee and I think, well, let me not get into hypotheticals, but as long as they don't sort of seem like they're being made in your official capacity in your role, and they don't sort of, again, this is a very handy sheet, Brandenburg, if they're not incitement of imminent violence, if it's not sort of following what are otherwise constitutional codes about what is acceptable speech. For example, in the public school context, it's you can't really be posting on your Twitter or X about and naming your students by name and complaining about them. That's a bad action that you could be reprimanded for. But if you just criticize the school board, for example, because they're not paying teachers enough, that's considered your own private speech, and you're speaking on a matter of public concern. That's the other key issue. If you're complaining about your boss and your boss catches wind, that's a little bit of a gray area. But if you're talking about something that's considered a matter of public concern, which can be, anything political, foreign policy, local town ordinances, anything like that, it's largely considered protected by the First Amendment. Okay, that's my boring case law spiel. And I'm happy to talk about some cases that I've worked on, but I also want to be respectful of time and and then we can take questions at the end, and I can maybe answer more specifics.
Yeah, I think what we'll do is we'll just, we can probably get back to that, because that
Great.
may come up if there's some specific issues. And I think
Yes.
there's a couple I got in my mind to ask you later.
Great.
So, okay?
Turning off my mic.
Okay, all right, sounds good. All right, Tom, you're up.
Thank you, Ivy, for for starting us off here. First, I'm so impressed and happy to be here because I think the subject that you're tackling would seem, I think, is that better?
Yeah.
That the idea of freedom of speech, one would think that this is like trying to explain to a fish about water because we're so used to it that we don't really give it second thought, or at least we didn't give it second thought. And I think right now, the very fact that you're having a program on that is indicative of concerns that people have about where we are going with the First Amendment just as a starting point, but certainly so many other things there. I just to repeat a little bit about my background. Obviously, I spent 35 years as a working reporter, almost all of that at the Miami Herald, and other than several years as an editor, I was the politics writer. So I am very familiar with the First Amendment and the limits of the First Amendment, how it works, what the exceptions are, and so forth. But I guess fundamentally, it was always like wearing a protective shroud. Like Harry Potter, periodic, you can wrap yourself in it, you can go anywhere you want, and you're going to be pretty safe. That's one of the things that I think right now is become troubling. It was, and Ivy, I appreciate your handing out this sheet of important Supreme Court free speech cases. If you go through that list, what strikes me right away is how protective the Supreme Court has been about free speech and has leaned in favor of that. Even, I think, I should go back to my friend Bruce Rogow here, that the Supreme Court justice who said that what we're talking about with free speech is freedom for the speech that we hate. And that's what I think right now is something that is under threat. I, as I say, spent most of my career as a journalist. I spent several more years as a journalism professor, and now I'm currently the politics and elections reporter for the Asheville Watchdog, which is, and I'll circle back and talk a little bit more about that later, but the Asheville Watchdog was started by a group of people like me, retired journalists. Most of us at the time at least had relatively comfortable retirements. We happened to be in the generation where retirements were guaranteed. They weren't dependent on how successful you were when you were investing your money. And I came to Asheville from Boston in March of 2020, and if you remember, that was just about the same week that we began to read about this thing called COVID spreading from the West Coast across the country. And some other retired journalists got together and said, maybe we can take advantage in a sense of we have idle time in a way, and maybe we have something to offer the community. And we started the Asheville Watchdog, which its primary focus is investigative and deep dive reporting, the kind of journalism that unfortunately is not being done by so many local news organizations now, not because they don't want to, but they simply don't have the resources. The business model that supported journalism so well for so many years has shifted dramatically, and some might say negatively. And so there wasn't certainly, I think, a demand for the kind of journalism we do. I would be remiss not to mention that one of our newly hired watchdog editors and reporters is from here in Brevard, Dan DeWitt, and I think many of you may know Dan. So we, perhaps your loss has been our gain, and that Dan has now joined us. And I'll circle back a little bit to how that transition in what's happening in journalism has resulted in things like the steps that we're taking. What I do want to though talk a bit about here is we are in a time of transition in so many ways. I think the earth is shifting under us when it comes to what we have counted on in our democracy, the freedoms that we have, and perhaps the expectations that we have of each other. I put this little statement up there. I teach the introductory journalism class at Warren Wilson College, and this is one of the first things that I put up on the board, and it is, for me, more or less the cram course in what journalism is all about and what I want the students to even be thinking about. From who else but George Orwell, journalism is printing what powerful people don't want printed, all else is public relations. Implicit in that is journalism really is, and it's something of a cliche, but the goal of, certainly of the founders when they wrote the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law abridging, ... the freedom of speech and freedom of the press, they weren't talking about protecting gossip columnists or cartoonists or sports writers. They were talking about protecting journalists who would be willing to stand up to the powerful, and particularly the powerful in government. I mean, that's really what's radical. Some of you, I hope many of you are watching the Ken Burns documentary about the Revolutionary War. But I don't think we stop often enough and understand how revolutionary this whole was, and most revolutionary was the entire idea that we were going to be a nation that didn't have a king. We were going to be a nation that would have a constitution, and we would truly live up to, not perfectly certainly, but the idea that this is government of the people. And so our journalism has sprung from that, and it's so deeply rooted in the country. My career as a journalist really goes back to, I don't know if I can get this to work, but Dan would certainly remember this guy here. I'm gonna play it, and hopefully you might be able to hear it. I don't know if this does. Let me put this in. This is a man, you may recognize him in the blurry photograph here, George Wallace. This, I show this because I think it was Harry Truman that said the only thing that's new is the history that we've forgotten. And right now, what we are experiencing in our life and in our politics and in many ways public affairs, and I think in our democracy, is the kind of thing that has been rooted periodically in America. George Wallace exemplified that, but the one thing that I had wanted to make a point of was I covered Wallace's campaign as a young reporter in 1972, And I covered him again in 1976 when, after he had been the victim of the assassination. But the consistent message that George Wallace always put out there was rooted in racism. That was really part of it. But it was this sense about he represented the little guy, and the little guy was always getting screwed, and I'm going to stand up there and I'm going to say what it is. And politics, George Wallace obviously had to step out of politics, perhaps unfortunately because of the assassination attempt, but the pendulum swung in the other direction until Donald Trump. And what we are seeing in politics today, and why I'm mentioning this in terms of freedom of speech and democracy, is that this is it's unprecedented, I think, in the experience of anybody in this room, to have a president that acts as hostilely toward the press as anyone. I don't even have to tell you what we may have seen, and probably just go back 2 or 3 weeks. And there would be numerous examples of Donald Trump making personal, crude attacks at journalists, calling a woman journalist piggy, shut up piggy, and telling another that she was stupid. And those are the kind of things that just shock most people, and it should shock most people. Not that there haven't been something similar before, but what strikes me, and I do think what ties into how we should be conscious of this as having an impact on freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and ultimately the role of the media in maintaining democracy, is the chilling effect that that this has, and the almost contagion that results from this. It was, I think, somewhat eye-raising when Donald Trump began in his first term to talk about the press as the enemy. What we see now goes far beyond the press as the enemy. There is now posted, starting a week ago, you go to the whitehouse.gov website, and there you will find a button you can click that you can, it's designed for people to report what they believe is excesses of the press. And they have a scandal of the week on that webpage, and they will identify news organizations that Donald Trump views as the enemy. And he goes into great detail about what they've done. The idea of normalizing attacks on the media, the mainstream media, to the extent that this becomes part of a White House website, I think 10 years ago would have absolutely shocked us that we've gotten there. Not that the press hasn't been worthy of pushback. You should see that, and I applaud that when it happens. But this is not of that ilk. What we are seeing now from the highest levels of government are efforts to undermine both the efforts of what the press is doing, even when it's evidence-based, and through that, I think, undermining what democracy is all about. I write a column for the Asheville Watchdog, as I mentioned. We talked about what the column should be, what I should be looking at in the column. We ended up, not my suggestion, but another editor's, we would call the column Democracy Watch. And the whole idea is that the one thing that I think we have to be conscious of is that when there are attacks on institutions, we have, fortunately, I think, some elements in the judiciary that are still our bulwarks against us. But whether those institutions can maintain what they were, I believe, constitutionally intended to do in the face of these attacks is something we need to be concerned about and worry about. Why is this happening, I think, is another question, is how did we get to a point where the President of the United States, probably the most powerful and influential individual in the world, would act in this way? It's one thing to push back and criticize the press and point out when the press has made mistakes. That's what advocacy and free speech is all about. It's another thing to attack on a personal level and in myriad ways. The number of lawsuits, for instance, that this administration has brought, settlements that have been pulled out of organizations like ABC and NBC. You have the leaders of major communication organizations, Zuckerberg's, Bezos, contributing huge amounts of money to avoid pressure from the administration, intimidation, I think, in significant ways. So the question of, well, how did we get there? And I think one of the major contributing factors is the economic shift that the so-called, I mentioned earlier, the business model that fueled good journalism for more than 100 years. If you wanted to sell your car or your couch or rent an apartment or even maybe go looking at houses on the weekend, 25 years ago, the way you would do that is you'd probably pick up the local newspaper and you'd go to the classified ads and you'd see, well, this is how we find it out. Along came the internet. I'm not faulting the internet for it, but the business model was no longer sustainable. People who wanted to sell their couch or rent a car, and we had the internet. You could go there, you could do a search. And so ultimately, as the classified ads collapsed, display ads, people shifted to the internet. And the power of the press, I think a power that the founding fathers had assumed would be there, has been splintered. It's not totally a bad thing. It also has put the power in the hands of people, the ability to disseminate information that otherwise was kept by maybe a few that began to think of themselves as elite, as George Wallace pointed out in that speech there. So I'm not someone who says this is a bad thing. A result of it, though, is that the press's ability to carry out, I think, what clearly was intended in the First Amendment to be the so-called fourth branch of government, to provide a bulwark against the executive branch, the legislature, assuming too much power, that right now is changing. It's in transition. If you go back, I think I started, as I said, in the early 1970s as a reporter. The 75% of all the households in the United States in 1971, when I started, subscribed to a daily newspaper. And that's where they got their news. It was also the era, I think most of us remember, Uncle Walter Cronkite, where you could turn on the news, and millions of households did at 6:30 every night, and you got Walter Cronkite's view, or others who were in for ABC and NBC. But the whole idea was television was referred to as America's hearth. We would gather around the TV set at night like people in the earlier centuries gathered around a fireplace. And it created a sense of unity. There was the journalism that you were seeing in the daily newspapers and generally on those early networks was journalism that was delivered by well-meaning people. Yes, they may have had some leaned a little more left, some leaned a little more right, but I believe they really believed that they were stewards of something really important with the First Amendment. That is gone, of course. Technology came on. Everybody has the power in this thing here to be your own publisher. You can put out anything you want, and perhaps if you do it and you scare people or you have help from Russian propagandists, you can, it'll go viral. And now we have AI coming in, which is so deceptive and so extremely polished in what it does, that knowing what is real and what isn't real is very, very difficult for people. So it's a confusing time. The only, I don't want to sound totally depressed by it. It also, though, as journalism is going through a transition from being a source of so-called, I think, elite organizations putting out information and gatekeeping information from going out. As that's changing, and there are no filters on the information that's coming out, you're also starting to see organizations springing up on new media, influencers and others, people on Substack that you may follow, blogs, podcasts. There are other sources, and I have to believe that ultimately we'll work our way through this period of chaos and transition, and maybe the period of anger and crudity, and good people want good information. We all want to be smarter. And we're going to start looking for information, sources of information that will make us smarter, not necessarily make us angrier, and not divide us so much. And over time, I believe we'll start to see, maybe in different ways, different kinds of news. The old newspaper is dead. 7% of American households today get a newspaper. Again, that's gone from 75% just in my career. But people are still searching different ways, and organizations like the one I now work with and Dan DeWitt works with, the Asheville Watchdog, we supplement what's out there. We specialize and we focus, and we're nonprofit. We don't cost anything. We operate like public radio and public broadcasting. You can tune it in if you think what is being done in these nonprofit news organizations. Then they depend on you to send them money. If you don't like what they're doing, you don't send them money, and eventually, the bad ones are going to go out of business. When we first started in this nonprofit news area, there's an organization that sprang up called the Institute for Nonprofit Journalism, INN, and it was just, in some ways, just a place where people could gather, share information, and so forth. Initially, when it started, I think there were something like 50 news organizations around the country that joined it. There are now 6,000 organizations like the Asheville Watchdog, some of them larger, ProPublica, which many of you probably know, that almost every community of any size, and even small communities, will have a nonprofit news organization. It's interesting, we're in a library. I know there's in Holyoke, Massachusetts, when the local newspaper essentially went bankrupt, the local library came together and people who were interested in what was happening in that community began using the local libraries, initially its website, and then it sprang out, to be what is now the primary local source of good journalism in that little town of Holyoke, Massachusetts. I think we're starting to see that in a lot of places. So I tend to be, although I'm in some ways ringing the alarm bell, be very careful where you get your information today. But I'm optimistic that there is good information out there. We just have to be good consumers in picking it up. So, thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to be a little bit different. I'm probably going to be all over the place. So, I think most of us here are advocates of free speech, except when you are having holiday meals with your in-laws. You might wish someone would be a little bit quieter and restrict how much they say. But generally, attacks on free speech have been somewhat common in this country. It's not unusual. They've mostly occurred at the local and state level with some of the laws. For me, free speech is the freedom. An assault on free speech is an assault on our humanity. Okay? It's a quintessential to our being. If you go back, and I think most of you are about as old as I am, there's a few exceptions. You saw the first Planet of the Apes movie with Charlton Heston. How many of you saw that? Anybody? And you remember the scene where the humans cannot talk, and they're chasing Charlton Heston, and they catch him in this rope trap, and he says to them, "Take your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape." And they all are in shock because he was really sub-simian. They thought he was less than because he couldn't speak. Now, I want you to think about in your own life, a lot of you here are older, you had somebody pass away. I've had 2 parents pass away. I do not know what I would give to talk to them for 10 or 15 minutes. I think most of us would. Just to say thank you, share a story, get some advice, but it's crucial. I don't want to be sad about that, because on the other hand, the most delightful thing in the world is when a child first talks. How many of you there are going like, "Mama, she said mama, mom," you know? Those are the key things. And so speech is just at the core of who we are, okay? It's also entwined with all of our other rights, okay? Freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. If we didn't have freedom of speech, we really could not do those things. How are you going to convey a religious message if you can't talk? Okay? How are you going to assemble people to get together if you can't communicate with them? So those things are essential, and they're all intertwined. When Ivy was talking about her situation there, you know, it wasn't just freedom of speech, it was freedom of assembly, okay? So all of these things are intertwined. So when we talk about one, you're really talking about a lot of them, okay? And when you get into school systems, you're talking about freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and just a whole number of things, okay? Another thing I don't think people think about is what I refer to as the right of the listener. If I couldn't speak, or she couldn't speak, or he couldn't speak, okay, you would not hear our thoughts and our ideas, okay? And that's the key thing, is that anytime anybody's speech is impeded or restricted, that affects you, the listener, okay? I could sit in here and say, "Free speech, John." Well, I'll talk to myself the whole day. And so my times my wife probably thinks I do, okay? But you're the listener. And when you can't hear what somebody has to say, your rights are being taken away. Your ability to get different information, your ability to feel certain things, okay? So I want to keep that in mind. It's not mentioned in the Constitution, but I think it's implied that you have that right to listen. And to go to Tom's points about what's happening in the current administration, you know, they have selected a White House pool that is compliant, okay? So the reliable journalists, most of them, don't get a chance to go in there and listen to what's being said. And when they can't listen, they can't ask. So we're all being denied a right to getting that information, okay? All right, I'm going to go through some things here just real quickly, because free speech is everywhere. It affects everything, okay? Science. Galileo was arrested as a heretic because he said, sun's not the center of the universe, okay? You have the Scopes trial, all right? Medicine. University of Florida, you tried to prevent doctors, and I think this is right, Tom, from talking to their patients about if they had a gun in the house. Because if a patient came to them and they were depressed, wouldn't you want to know? Okay? Couldn't do that. And then, of course, we have all the situations with the Health and Human Services going on now where it's just like, you know, what are they saying? Is it true? Is it untrue? You know, should I follow them? You know, I'm going to call Dr. Nash or Dr. Wells, somebody here that really knows what they're doing for and making the decisions now. And then you go into the arts, of course. Your plays, The Crucible by Arthur Miller, A Streetcar Named Desire by Tennessee Williams. All of those in the past have been banned at some point in time in some place. okay? You look at your art, Andy Warhol, Robert Mapplethorpe, Andre Serrano, he's the one who did the Piss Christ. That's going to upset some people, right? Okay. Music. Oh, and my tie. My tie, my sons gave it to me. It looks like a kid's fishing on the bottom. He's not fishing, okay? It's my little funny, cute tie, all right? Something else is arcing into the water, okay? He's peeing if you didn't get it. All right. There is, you go into music, okay? A lot of people want to ban certain rap music, all right? But here's a couple I found out interesting in doing some research. Loretta Lynn wrote a song called The Pill about birth control. Tried to ban that in some places. Billie Holiday in 1939 had a song called Strange Fruit. It was about lynching. Tried to ban that. And I'm going to flip on the other side. I'm a graduate of the University of Mississippi. They played Dixie when I was there. Dixie is now banned, okay? So you got to look at both sides of things. Literature, you've got just a whole list, but some of the greats. Of Mice and Men, 1984. Here's one that's crazy. Where the Wild Things Are. What the heck? Okay? To Kill a Mockingbird. Fahrenheit 451, Hunger Games, and of course the one that a lot of kids have really loved 20, 30 years, well, in the last 20 years or so, I guess, all the Harry Potter books, okay? Affects education. In Florida, they have the Woke Act, trying to basically say, look, anybody, you can sue a teacher for whatever they say or talk about in the classroom, okay? That is more than a chilling effect, okay? And that's a freezing effect right there, all right? And then another one which I found really kind of funny, athletics. There were two announcers from the Masters who were no longer allowed to announce the Masters anymore. One was Jack Whitaker. And the reason, he said, the group was coming up to the 18th tee, and he said, "Here comes the mob." I guess it was they thought it was a reference to Italians, but I don't know. Anyway, he no longer did the Masters. And then another time, a guy named Gary McCord, the greens were really slick and the putts were going really fast, right? And he made the comment, "I don't think they mow these greens. I think they bikini wax them." Okay? A lot of people thought that was funny as heck, but he's not doing it anymore, okay? So my point there is that speech is everywhere, okay? It affects everything we do. Now, and so I think the thing, too, that you have to realize, it's not a lot of people who force this restriction. I think it's usually just a small number of people who force this restriction on people, okay? I don't see masses of people in the street like we had for the No Kings rally saying, you know, ban To Kill a Mockingbird. It's usually a handful of very organized people who restrict this speech and the chance for all of us to either read or listen, okay? Now, because I'm the local tie here, some of you probably want to know a few local salacious pieces, so I'll throw you a couple bones here. And I mean this no ill will towards some of the people who were involved, okay? Because they were good people. They have their own reasons for doing what they did. But when I taught at the charter school, first year we read the Diary of Anne Frank. And a couple days into reading it, I was told by the powers that be that we need to have a different version. No explanation, just need to have a different version. Okay. So, actually though, the kids knew, a couple of kids knew, because they were children of some of these people, and they said, "Oh, it's because of this." and it was about a passage about her menstruation, okay? So we got a different book, and didn't have that information in there. But the strange thing is, or the funny thing is that once the decision was made, what do you think the kids did? They said, "Here it is, Billy. Look, right here." This is before we had to turn the books in. "It's on page 253, paragraph 3, right there." That's what it said. And they all flipped to it, and they all read it, you know. And so it's like with anything with kids. When you try to ban something from them, what are they going to do? They're going to go read it, right? So, and then the other thing they did, there's a book that they used called What Your Fifth Grader Needs to Know. And they took out, again, the powers that be, took out 2 pages. The book's in the library here if you want to go read them. They're pages 354 and 355. And you can learn about human reproduction, okay? So those are things that I think happen a lot in the United States. They're certainly not the huge assault that Tom and Ivy have been talking about, but they happen all the time. They happen in the best of times, and the things that I think we need to keep an eye on, okay? The other problem then is when you have these things occur, it's like as an instructor, what do you say? What do you say if you're teaching Romeo and Juliet and the kids ask about the jokes that the nurse makes or Mercutio makes? Okay? What can you read, Huck Finn? Because of the language in Huck Finn? Can you read Malcolm X? You know, pretty wild ideas. Can you talk about homosexuality in ancient Greece? You know, some of the kids were kind of shocked, like, what? You know, they were basically bisexual, you know. You can read a whole treatise on friendship by Aristotle, and the whole idea was that you have to be friends with someone who's an equal of you. And if you saw Harry Met Sally, that kind of played in that movie, because it's like, I can't be friends with you. Or, you know, can a guy and a girl actually be friends? Or is it just going to be, there's always got to be some sexual aspect to it, right? So there's the questions that pop up in the classroom. And the thing that's damaging, that's been mentioned here, is that the kids don't learn how to discuss different things, okay? There's a chilling effect on the guided discussion of controversial topics. And that's what we need. And that's what kids love. You get into a conversation with them, they eat it up, right? But if we deny them that now as children, they're not going to be able to do it as adults. They're just going to sit there and look at each other and go like, well, you know, I'm right, you're wrong, okay? And that's all there is to it. So it's pretty bad. A couple more things, and then I'll stop. There's something else we talked about, free speech here. I'd like to talk about the flip side of free speech and what I call concealed speech, okay? Now, this I think is pretty appalling, and I hope it's right. I checked it off of the internet a couple of times. But in October of 2025, our legislators exempted themselves from public records. Is that right, Tom? I think, okay. Yeah, okay, yeah. And so the law basically had allowed, you know, you and I and anybody else to obtain documents from the state government and elected officials, okay? You could get copies of the emails that were sent to them, okay? Public people doing public work, excuse me, so you have the right to see what they're doing, okay? They're supposed to work for us, all right? But they put a provision in the budget bill that cut out access from anyone seeking their records or the records in their staff, okay? So you have this idea now of I don't work for you. You can't see what I'm doing. You can't see what my conversations have been, okay? Which is appalling, okay? There's also been a move for over several years now for the government to attempt to remove legal notices from newspapers, okay? Maybe a lot of you didn't live here a long time ago, or that long, but they wanted to dam the Horse Pasture River many years ago. And there was a public notice about that. And there was a huge outcry because people saw that, okay? But there have been other things that have happened in the past now, and there have been movements to put that information, not just in North Carolina, but in other states, on the state or the city or the county websites. But they bury it somewhere. And how are you going to know if there's something that's controversial, right? Somebody's got to give you some inside scoop to say, hey, go to the City of Brevard website. And I know you wouldn't do this, Mayor. Thank goodness you're our mayor. But, you know, you got to go to the City of Brevard website and dig deep underneath the personnel issues. And here's this thing that you need to be concerned about, or it's in the zoning section, okay? So that becomes, I think, problematic, all right? And this is from the Publishers Auxiliary, which for some reason I still get. And it says proper public notice is essential. And it is. You need to notify the public as many ways as possible about things that can affect them, okay? Another one, and some people here in the county commission or the school board may not like this, but it irritated me when I was the editor. And that was 2-on-2 meetings between the school board members and the county commissioners, because it was not a public meeting. You didn't have a quorum, okay? Yet conversations were held. No decisions were made, but there were certainly, I think, from my experience, some agreements made, okay? Or somebody said, oh, well, this so-and-so, you know, from our conversations, this will happen. And so it's just a way to circumvent the open meetings law, right? And I just think that's wrong. I think as a public servant, the public issue needs to be conducted in the public, okay? The last thing I'll talk about, and then we'll go to questions, and so far nobody's brought up any questions, so we'll see. Is that there are other things that we don't think about that affect free speech. And that's, for example, the Federal Trade Commission. Some of us, you know, we don't pay attention to what they do, but they've approved all these mergers. And so like Tom was talking about before, the consolidation of corporate media, okay? You've got all these things going on where Bezos owns the Washington Post, the Murdochs own Fox News and the Wall Street Journal. Disney owns ABC and ESPN. Well, you can sure as heck bet that ABC isn't going to say anything bad about Disney or ESPN, okay? So not only are they going to be protective of themselves, but it's the consolidation and of power within such many small groups, okay? And that then affects things like also you get into like labor agreements, contracts, okay, because as Ivy pointed out before, you're in a right to work state, and I talked about this briefly before, and I'll just ask you straight out right now. In a right to work state, are our options, is it easier to repress our freedom of speech?
Yes. I mean, it turns on the public-private question. If you work for the government, this First Amendment applies, but if you work for a private entity, then you have virtually no protections unless your workplace has them written into whatever their policy handbook, or you're unionized or something like that.
Okay, thank you. All right, so that's the chatting proportion of our meeting. So we're going to go for some questions here for about 20 minutes. All right, one question here is, how do we reinstate the fairness doctrine? Either one of you want to handle that? Or Tom?
I don't think that that's possible. the fairness doctrine essentially was perhaps overtaken by technology, by communication technology. The argument, this was first proposed by Ronald Reagan, and the argument was the fairness doctrine essentially said that if on television, because they're all licensed, if someone makes a statement on television, then equal time has to be given to somebody with a contrary point of view. And that operated in the, 30, 40, 50 years of radio and television. But the argument seemed a bit archaic. Ivy, you can correct me if I get this wrong, but with the emergence of CNN and cable television, later was Fox, but the argument was we do not need to have a requirement that on the same network where someone makes a statement, we have to have someone making a contrary statement, because there is so much media available today, so many media channels available, that that there's no need to worry that the public won't have alternative points of view available to them in the sort of the marketplace of ideas. So, and that was in the 1980s. You can imagine the explosion of different communication channels that have come about then and that we live in today. It's that old idea about we're trying to take a sip out of a fire hydrant when you look for information now, and there is no way that that will get put back in the box.
Okay. All right. I don't know if either one of you can answer this one. What is the status of the administration's efforts to review your social media feed upon entering the U.S.? You know,
I mean, we've certainly heard of that happening. And I think most of our social media feeds, or many folks' social media feeds, are public. So I always caution people, think about the public-private nature of what you're putting out there. I think there are a lot of concerns with, like, if what someone says in their private time is now being held against them as they're trying to gain access to this country. But it is a little bit of an open question of law as to, like, the extent of First Amendment rights for non-citizens, though I think we would obviously take the position that anyone in the United States gets the full protection of the Constitution.
All right. As a follow-up of that, the Charlie Kirk situation, and I think there have been, I think Dan had told me, Mr. Carter, that there have been 600 professors and teachers who have lost their jobs on postings about his death. And some of them were very innocuous. They didn't celebrate his death or anything like that. Would they have been fired if they just said those things, or is there a difference between saying it, at a campus, or just, you post it on social media? And I think from what you said before about the Wilmington case, or one of the cases, it seemed to me as if you're posting it on your own, not on your own site, then they don't have a right to tell you what you can do if you're a public employee. Is that correct?
Generally, I mean, I think, unfortunately, with the First Amendment, everything is always very nuanced, and it's also constantly changing as, like, our society is evolving. But ultimately, that's true. If you're a public university professor posting something on your private social media about a matter of public concern, which Charlie Kirk's death, I think, speaks to a number of public issues, it would be protected. So I hope that all those individuals have sought out legal help, but I know not everyone has the ability to do so, and it is highly concerning. But yeah, I mean, we obviously heard of instances in North Carolina of like high school teachers who wrote, like, there was a public school teacher in Wake County who wrote something that I think was, like, maybe loosely interpreted as celebrating Charlie Kirk's death, and he was in fact reprimanded. I think he was ultimately reinstated, But the importance of the First Amendment is that even someone celebrating Charlie Kirk's death, it might be in poor taste, but just because someone finds that offensive doesn't mean it's not protected speech.
Okay. All right. Tom, I don't know, either one of you can answer this one, I guess. What recourse does a, quote, public person have when they are maliciously lied about?
Damn few. I think there's a great film that Paul Newman was a mob boss and was accused in the local newspaper by Sally Fields, who was the reporter, that he had committed a murder. And Paul Newman came into the newsroom, happened to be filmed in the Miami Herald, that's why I know all the details of this. Came in, he confronted Sally Fields as a reporter, and but Sally Fields claimed that when she wrote the story, she went to talk to the newsroom's lawyer. And the lawyer ran through a bunch of things. The lawyer said to her right away, said, it doesn't matter whether you think this is true or not. What matters is whether we can defend you against a libel suit. And he ran through a list of things that he thought would be helpful to know in defending her against a libel suit that Paul Newman's character was about to bring. And one of the questions that the lawyer asked the reporter, Sally Fields, is he a celebrity or a football coach? He said, if he was a football coach, we're in the clear because you can say anything about a football coach and nobody can sue you for libel. And he had a bunch of things. But there is the question, and this is on the sheet here, New York Times versus Sullivan, was the landmark case in which it gave broad protection to the media in the course of reporting if they were reporting on people who essentially held themselves out as public people. And this affects celebrities and football coaches, and I guess a lot of people. It's very difficult. That's why you can go through the grocery store and you can see in the National Enquirer or whatever the ones that are out there now, and they'll have say the most outrageous things, and there's no way that they can turn around, almost no way they can turn around and sue for libel because they are public by choice, and so that's a portion of the law that may not change. Now, however, there are a couple of justices that are hoping, I think, to get the right case. Justice Thomas is one who's been pushing for this to readdress that landmark case, New York Times versus Sullivan, and maybe make it easier for people in the public eye, celebrities. I'm going to put Bruce on a spot in the back there, but I was held out as a public figure when the Miami Herald got sued by a client of Bruce's in a case that books have been written about, and because I was something of a public figure as a columnist and editor at the Miami Herald. And a movie was also made about a story I was involved in, the Gary Hart story, people may remember. And there's a movie called The Front Runner that came out. It was very sort of pro-Gary Hart, didn't like the idea that a newspaper had actually caught him committing adultery and forced him out of the race, and I was the one who did that, so I was the bad guy in the movie. And the character who played me, I like to think, didn't resemble me very much. But I was told, you know what, you got to suck it up. There's nothing you can do because you are a public figure, and just because they put a character in the movie and that character didn't do a lot of credit to you, there's just nothing you can do.
Okay. I've got a question here. It's kind of similar because you're an investigative journalist, and government never announces without outside provocation that they did something wrong. They're not going to come out and say, or at least in my experience of what I remember, the Pentagon's not going to say, "Oh yeah, we shot 15 of our own guys," or "We blew up the wrong people." So as an investigative journalist, you've done that. And I'm thinking about your former paper employer, the Miami Herald, breaking the Epstein case. So I guess my question is, how do you feel? I feel like you are speaking up for the vulnerable, the common person, the person who has no other option because they don't have the money to hire high-powered attorneys, or they're not government officials. And when the president says journalists are the enemy of the people, I kind of take that to be like, then if you're the enemy of the people, you're really not, because you are representing the people who don't have any power, and you are bringing their stories to the forefront. Is that a fair assessment of what you're doing?
That sounds like coaching the witness, right?
I just,
Yeah.
yes, I'm coaching the witness, sorry.
Absolutely, that's the truth. That's what we do. That old line about that the role of journalists is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I think there's probably a lot to that.
Okay. All right. Thank you for following that leading question there. Okay. I had a question here. How does government control social media and the tribal or fake or untrue content? Yeah, and then, okay. That's one of them. I don't know if we can answer that one, right? I mean, I don't know how the government can control those things.
I think that's more of an ethical question than anything. I mean, they're private companies. I don't know how much the government can prescribe
yeah.
rules on these.
But whatever you post on social media has the same same meaning as if you posted something on the front page of the New York Times. You can libel someone just by printing up a flyer like this and distributing it on Main Street if it's not true. And so you say something on social media, unless you're very clear that this is just my opinion. I have an opinion that somebody is a scumbag, but it's fine. That's First Amendment right. But what you can't say is that this person is a child pedophile, and then circulate that, where you've clearly done harm to someone, and that harm can be demonstrated. So it doesn't matter if it's on social media.
Okay. But then how does Section 230 fit into that?
Well, that only protects essentially that protects Facebook or any of the platforms that distribute it. That doesn't protect the individual.
Okay, can you explain Section 230 real quick to people? So they know what it is, so they'll know what it means.
That's the section of the communications law. Someone else here may be more plugged into this than I am, but it's a section of communications law that basically says that you can't hold the platform on which libelous information is distributed as responsible for the libel.
But you can hold a newspaper liable, right?
Yes.
So seems like it's dual.
Well, that's because the newspaper has control over every word that the newspaper publishes, whereas the platforms that may distribute everything from X to Lord knows what, there's so many of them, they don't really have control over what an individual might post. They would have to employ, I don't know, unknown numbers of people to actually go through every tweet that somebody wanted to put out in order to live up to it. And that was the argument that the social media corporations made, is that it would be just impossible to put the same burden on them that would be put on newspapers. Newspapers have control over every word that they put in the paper.
Yeah, even though social media platforms are billions and billions and billions of dollars, they couldn't hire those
Not
people.
even though, but because they are.
Right,
Yeah.
because they have all those billions and billions. There was a conflict at our newspaper because when we first started putting things on social media, it was either you control nothing or you control everything.
Right.
And that seemed messed up to me.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to get a couple more questions in here. Some people's handwriting, I'm sorry, is really hard to read. So, why does free speech often seem to end when the topic is protest about, let's say, genocide in Gaza or certain things? And that's right in your bailiwick, right?
Sure. Well, I think that's a very complicated issue about why certain subject matters might be more subject to regulation than others. And it certainly depends on who is in charge of the regulation. And the obviously what's happening in Gaza was deemed acceptable and not something that is worth protesting by certain powers that be. And so therefore, when students and people come out en masse protesting that issue, it was decided that it was okay to react in a certain way. And I think this has happened in a number of issues throughout our history, that disfavored ideas are met with stronger reaction than others. I think it's as simple as that. It's just the people in charge decided that it was okay to respond more forcefully to these issues than others. That doesn't mean it's right. That's why we've litigated it. Although ultimately, I think for our case against UNC, the subject matter of the protest is sort of irrelevant. It's that they're suppressing protected speech.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question for you, Ivy. When you take these cases, because you took one about a professor who said something a couple of years ago, and it's like, yeah, you lost your job, right? And but you won the case, right? You'll need to explain it better than I am. But what do these people get when they win? I mean, do they just get their job back? Do they get a couple $1 million, or what? I mean, it's if you're being denied a basic right, then it's like, oh, well, we did it for 18 months. You hired an attorney. Now you can go back into your job. Is that all they get? I mean, that doesn't seem like it's very punitive to the people who are trying to deny them of a real right.
Well, so this instance of the UNC professor was placed. It wasn't a case. He was placed on administrative leave, and that lasted a week. We got involved, wrote a letter to the university on Wednesday, and on Friday had a call with general counsel saying he was going to be reinstated. So he was on paid administrative leave. So he certainly suffered reputational harm, I would say, although I think ultimately he was more supported than he was rooted against in that situation. But just really to answer your question, it totally depends on the goal of the individual. And I will say, like, damages cases are often, or can be, harder than what we call injunctive or equitable relief cases. So equitable relief or injunctive relief, my hearing on this UNC case is on next week, is whether or not to grant us a preliminary injunction, which is essentially saying, having the court order UNC to, in this case, allow our plaintiffs back on campus. They've been issued indefinite trespass bans from the entirety of UNC Chapel Hill's campus. For some of them, that includes their medical doctor's offices, while the litigation is pending. So that's a form of relief where they can be reinstated while the courts take their sweet time to actually decide anything. And so you can minimize the harm there. But in terms of damages cases, it's much harder to quantify the actual injury. I think for someone who has lost their job for a certain period of time, that's much easier to quantify because you know what their salary is and you can ask for like you back pay and what they would have been owed. But I think ultimately like the reputational harm, that person probably or may not want to go back to work at that institution if they were wrongly terminated. I think it is very hard to capture through litigation. I think that's just one avenue of recourse. And courts also are often unwilling to enact what might be truly punitive
Okay.
punishment.
All right. I guess, because part of my thought is, Fox News was sued for their comments about the election results, and not the election results, but they were sued by the voting company, and they ended up settling for $787 million. So it's like, okay, well, to me, like if somebody lies about you, and that's a clear libelous thing, there should be some real repercussions for those people doing that.
Yes, that actually, I think, goes to the question of the type of claim that you're raising, because libel ultimately arises under sort of the First Amendment and what is and is not protected speech, but libel is actually a tort claim for which it's much easier to get monetary damages as opposed to a constitutional claim under Section 1983. So there, the voting machine makers were arguing a tort claim. This is why the law is fun and not complicated at all.
Okay, that's why you get a lawyer, right? And make sure she gets the right thing. All right, it's getting close to our closing time here, and I apologize for some of these questions I'm not going to get to. But maybe this is a good one to wrap up on. And I think it's something that maybe both of you touched on, is how do we respond to misinformation and disinformation while protecting the First Amendment? Are there any promising areas of potential legislation that could untangle these issues? And I think that's part of what we're trying to do here with our TPD group, is trying to get people correct information. But the other part of that for me is, how do we allow the democratization of the internet where people can have their rights to express themselves and have a lot of people read it, but also keep a fact-based information flowing? So if you answer that, you're going to get a lot of money.
That's a quest. It's like asking that I worked for the Knight Ridder Corporation for many years. They published some great newspapers, and the founder of that corporation was a man named John S. Knight, was a great journalist. And as he started to acquire newspaper properties, including the Miami Herald, he would be asked, what do you expect of your journalists? And his answer was to find the truth and print it, which sounded very simple, and it sounded very aspirational and uplifting. But of course, the problem you run into is, who has the truth? What is truth? How do you know it? And I think where we have come down and why the First Amendment is so important to us is, in some ways, we seek the truth by arguing about it. I have this point of view, and this is what I think, and this is my evidence, and this other person has a different point of view about that, and this is their evidence. And just like in a court case, both sides will argue it out, and you try to get to some place that maybe is closer to the truth than either one of the others were. And it's in the marketplace, and the marketplace has to be open to those kinds of discussions, even sometimes if they're antagonistic toward each other. As far as that, right now, this is extremely difficult because the sources of information are coming from places that we can't identify. And if you can't identify, you can't assess credibility. That is going to get worse with future generations, I fear, for my students and the world that they're going to grow up in. But ultimately, it comes down to you don't want to have censors deciding what should be out there or not, and I think it'd be almost impossible to do it anyway. But what you do want is a media literacy. That's an expression you may hear a lot about. You just have to hope that people become good consumers of information, just like we all try to be good consumers of a product that we buy. And that means you find out, well, where did this source get that information? What is transparent about it? Can I validate that source? Do I trust that source? What's the reputation of it? These are complicated questions, but critically important. And I think that's, if there is an answer to what you're saying, it's not going to be to have a group of censors deciding what's true or not true. It's just being in a marketplace where we have people who are knowledgeable consumers and ultimately working against one another sometimes. Something close to credible information will emerge. At least I hope that's the case.
Okay, well, it's, you know, I didn't even prompt you or for that exact answer, but it does kind of lead me to this old school book I have, John Stuart Mill on Liberty, and the second section is on thought and discussions, and basically there's a tremendous amount in there, but it's basically the art of discussion of somebody's either completely wrong or they're completely right, and then there's that whole range in between. And even if you're completely right, for somebody to challenge you is good because you can then develop your own argument, okay? I know a person in this audience who had someone try to convince them that the world was flat, right? Well, you know, if you just can't say, well, you idiot, it's round, we all know that. I mean, you just look at a globe, right? But you might make you think of different ways to explain, well, okay, how am I going to approach this person? How am I going to show them that the world isn't flat, all right? You know, and I thought about that crazy things I think about. I thought, well, yeah, this is how you can show them how it's not flat, you know? You have a table here, you put a light here. This is North Carolina, that's LA, you know? We're both going to have the sun come up at the same time. It's going to go down at the same time. Does that happen? Well, no, you know. But I think part of it is like when you discuss with other people, you have to sharpen your understanding of your position, which seems to be missing a lot. So with that, we have to be completely out of here by 8:30. So with that, I will say, first of all, my apologies if we did not get to your questions. Secondly, thank all of you for being here very much for this forum. Appreciate you being here, and have a safe trip home.